I am honoured tonight to speak on the Marriage Amendment Definition and Religious Freedoms Bill 2017. Firstly, I would like to recognise the Coalition Government, who initiated the process to firstly give the Australian people their say, and who then followed through by putting this bill before Parliament to implement the will of the Australian people. And the view of the Australian people was emphatic, both nationally and in Dunkley. Nationally, the result was 61.6% yes from those who exercised the democratic right to have their say, with a national participation of 79.5%. In my electorate of Dunkley, the result was even higher, with 72% saying yes, the 19th highest out of 150 electorates across Australia. In addition, the participation rate was also higher than nationally, with Dunkley participation being at 81.7%. There were some other interesting statistics that came out of the postal survey, being that by party, 63.3% said yes in majority Liberal seats, 61.7% in majority Labor seats, 59.8% in majority LNP seats, and 56.8% in majority National seats. Indeed, for the no-vote electorates, 11 are held by Labor, 4 by the Liberals, 1 by the Nationals and 1 by the Katter Party. So it appears that Liberal voters in general were very favourable towards a yes vote. Given the Coalition brought to the 2016 election a promise to give the Australian people their say over the issue, I backed this decision both during and after the election. I believe in being consistent and in keeping promises. I also note that Labor had 6 years in government to take action on this issue, but didn't put the issue to either the people and/or the Parliament. It is a Liberal coalition government that has taken action, Mr Deputy Speaker, resulting in this bill today. Now, irrespective of one's views on holding this postal survey, I do note at least one clear benefit. It has made the majority view of Australians who wanted to have their say in the postal survey clear. That then strengthens Parliament in now changing the Marriage Act in line with the outcome, such that Parliament cannot be accused of not implementing the will of the Australian people. On this substantive issue, my position has been consistent for many years, including in my maiden speech, where I said I would be a strong advocate for freedom. In essence, notwithstanding my own views on Christian marriage, I support the freedom of any two consenting adults to marry under secular state law. At the same time, I also support the freedom of any person to express their own religious or personal views on the issue of marriage, and not to be forced to act or express a view against their own conscience. On supporting the freedom of any two people to marry under state law, in my maiden speech I made my view clear. I stated, I am a Liberal because I support freedom and liberty. I added that a state should not impose any religion or worldview, such as Christianity, Islam or atheism, nor should a state restrict the practice of any religion or worldview. It should allow freedom of religion, including freedom to express one's views, critique and criticise. Now, I should note, Mr Deputy Speaker, that I am a practising Christian. As a person with a Christian faith, I believe that Christian marriage is between a man and a woman. Having said that, I do recognise that this biblical interpretation is not consistent across all Christian denominations, or even within denominations, although it still remains the majority view within Christianity. But this debate is not about biblical interpretations. In implementing equality under the law, I have always favoured the minimal government approach of changing the Marriage Act to a Relationships Act, with the Commonwealth getting out of the business of defining marriage and only legislating as to the contractual relationship between two people. This would have created equality under the law, while in my view better protecting freedoms of religion, belief, conscience and speech. While my preference still remains for the state not to legislate as to marriage, I recognise that we have chosen to go down the path of extending the definition of marriage under state law as the way to implement a majority yes vote. As parliamentarians, in doing so, we are legislating as to state-defined marriage. We are not legislating as to Christian marriage, which I believe is, can be and should remain able to be defined differently from state marriage. So in line with my belief in freedom under the principles of classical liberalism, I publicly stated that, while I have my own personal Christian views on marriage, I would be voting yes in the postal survey to allow for same-sex marriage under state law. I believe this is a position that many Christians, like myself, took up in distinguishing between Christian marriage and state marriage. I always like to put the shoe on the other foot, so let's consider a hypothetical that state law says that marriage was only between two consenting adults of the same sex, restricting Christians of the opposite sex from marrying under state law. If that was the case, I would also expect that people would support state law not restricting the definition of marriage and allowing for equality under the law for people of the opposite sex to marry. The same reasoning can apply to expanding the definition of marriage to allow for same-sex marriage. In the same way, under state law, we do not impose Christian biblical morality as to divorce, adultery, sex before marriage and so forth. We distinguish between the two. This does not mean that Christians do not, cannot or should not hold these views personally, implement them in their own lives or express those views publicly. Having voted yes in the postal survey, I also noted that I would support the majority will of the people in Parliament. In accordance with the will of the people of Dunkley and Australia, I will also be voting yes in Parliament. And I know how important a yes vote is for many individuals who might wish to marry, or at least have the right to marry in Australia, which includes a number of colleagues, family members, former housemates, friends, schoolmates, and people in my electorate of Dunkley. I do not underestimate what a yes vote means for them. Equally, Mr Deputy Speaker, I also publicly stated that I would be firmly advocating that any subsequent legislation following a yes vote by the Australian people provide strong protections for freedom of speech and religion, which are absolutely crucial in a liberal democracy. These are freedoms that our Constitution only provides limited protection for and can be changed and reduced by this or a future Parliament via a simple majority vote. As such, while supporting the freedom of any two people to marry by voting yes, I will also be supporting amendments to put to this bill to provide strong protections for religious liberty and freedoms of conscience, speech and belief. I will not sway away from my consistent belief in freedom, even if it is unpopular. I personally believe that protections should not only include exemptions, but also provide proactive protections of freedoms. Essentially, I support an individual's freedom to express their religious or personal views and not be forced to act or express views against those beliefs. Now, I commend Senator Dean Smith in putting forward his bill and the efforts of the Senate Select Committee members, including the way that they have conducted themselves during this debate. But I believe protections under this bill must go further, including for churches, other religious bodies and practitioners, such as for religious ministers, celebrants, lay preachers and personnel, whether in meetings, proselytisation or expressing views privately or in public, for religious schools, for organisations set up on the basis of religious principles, including charities, for the press, for individuals expressing their religious or personal views in their everyday lives, their employment and so on, for parents in terms of their parental choice for their children on what they are taught, and for business owners or organisations when asked to send out a message they disagree with. For example, an LGBTIQ publisher should be able to refuse to print a book advocating for Christian marriage, and a Christian, Islamic or other religious publisher should equally be able to refuse to print a book advocating for marriage equality. That is, people should be able to freely express their religious and personal views in a peaceful manner under our liberal democracy. Equally, people should not be forced to express, adopt, remain silent or participate in a view that they cannot in their conscience agree with. These are freedoms that were fought for by our forebears in wars and in the debates of the halls of our parliaments. These are freedoms that should be supported by anyone, even if they disagree with what a person is saying. As Evelyn Beatrice Hall said, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to your death your right to say it." The amendments being moved, I believe, are realistic and reasonable in giving strong protections and safeguards to Australians, above that provided in the current bill, while not allowing for discrimination for anyone. That's why I'm happy to put my consistent support for freedom into action by not only voting yes in the bill, but by supporting the amendments and seconding one of the protection amendments being moved. Also notable, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that 38 faith leaders from across Australia have drafted an open letter to the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition expressing their concerns about the need for more protections in the current bill. In addition, surveys point to the fact that a majority of Australians support these freedoms. In one recent survey, 60% of respondents supported the right of churches and ministers of religion to say no to conducting same-sex marriage ceremonies. 61% supported the ability of parents to say no to certain teaching content for their children in primary schools. 53% supported the ability of people who believe in marriage between a man and a woman to speak freely, and 59% supported business owners and faith-based charities to hold and practice their beliefs. I am therefore pleased to be supporting the majority will of the Australian people, both in voting yes to legalise same-sex marriage, but also in voting to protect freedoms. And these are protections that should be supported by my fellow parliamentarians on both sides. So it is disappointing that those in the opposition have not been allowed by the leaders, as it currently stands, to express their free will and conscience on amendments being put forward. They must follow the party line. In contrast, our party, the Party of Freedom, has allowed for free will in putting forward and supporting or not supporting any amendments. At the same time, I will not support any amendments that could frustrate or potentially frustrate the process of this bill being implemented by the Parliament. I will be focusing on substantive amendments. I will also vote yes, irrespective of whether the amendments get through, in line with the outcome of this survey, to implement the yes result to change the legislation to allow for same-sex marriage. We have promised the Australian people to implement this bill before Christmas, and I will ensure that occurs. I am also cognisant that the likelihood of the protection amendments getting through is minimal, but we must try, as protecting all freedoms is critical. I would hope I am wrong and that my fellow parliamentarians will support some or all of the amendments. In any event, I am pleased that the Honourable Philip Ruddock has been appointed by the Prime Minister to lead a review into religious protections, and that the Prime Minister has himself indicated his support for a number of amendments. I would hope Mr Ruddock's review can also recommend legislative changes to support wider protections for free speech and freedom of religion that can be implemented in the new year, such as charter protection of our freedoms and liberties, as I suggested in my maiden speech. Overall, I have adopted my position in both voting yes and supporting protections because I support freedom. It is on the basis of these principles I joined the Liberal Party. In summary, as a person of religious faith, I support the freedom of any two consenting adults to marry under state law. Equally, I encourage those in favour of any two consenting adults marrying to support the freedom of those with a religious faith under state law. And I encourage my colleagues on all sides to do the same, because, as Maximilian II said, God alone rules the consciences of men, man only rules man.